Only 3 people knew that recording existed, and Jasmine Crockett was one of them. When Melania Trump called her unfit, she was just one click away from revealing those horrifying words to America. The phrase, "Who cares about the children?" was about to change everything. The Capitol chamber had never felt this electric. Every seat was filled, every camera was rolling, and every breath in the room seemed synchronized with the tension that crackled through the air like lightning before a storm. This wasn't just another congressional hearing on border policy. This was political theater at its most dangerous, where reputations could be built or destroyed with a single sentence, a single moment of truth that cuts through years of carefully crafted public personas. Jasmine Crockett sat at the witness table, her dark blue blazer crisp and professional, her expression calm but alert. At 33, she had already earned a reputation as one of the most formidable legal minds in Congress, a former trial attorney who had defended the defenseless and taken on systems that others were afraid to challenge. Her colleagues knew that behind her composed exterior was a strategic mind that could dismantle arguments with surgical precision, and today she would need every ounce of that skill. Across from her, in the section reserved for special witnesses, sat Melania Trump. The former First Lady looked every inch the part of American royalty, her platinum blonde hair perfectly styled, her cream-colored designer suit without a single wrinkle. She had agreed to testify about her charitable work with immigrant children, positioning herself as a compassionate advocate who had worked tirelessly to improve conditions at detention facilities. Her testimony had been polished, practiced, and delivered with the kind of measured grace that had made her a global fashion icon and diplomatic figure. But Jasmine knew something that the cameras didn't capture, something that the carefully choreographed hearing couldn't reveal. Hidden in her leather portfolio, saved on her laptop, was an audio file that had been sent to her office 3 weeks earlier by a whistleblower whose identity she was still protecting. The recording was crystal clear, authenticated by multiple forensic audio experts, and absolutely damning. It captured Melania Trump in an unguarded moment, speaking to her staff during a particularly difficult period of family separation policies at the border. The hearing had begun routinely enough. Committee Chairman Marcus Webb, a seasoned Republican from Alabama, had welcomed both witnesses with the kind of formal courtesy that congressional hearings demanded. Melania had testified for 45 minutes about her initiatives, her visits to detention centers, and her advocacy for immigrant children. She spoke eloquently about the challenges facing these vulnerable populations and her commitment to finding solutions that honored both American security and humanitarian values. Her performance was flawless. Every answer was measured, every emotion seemed genuine, and every policy position was carefully calibrated to appeal to both her conservative base and moderate Americans who wanted to believe in compassionate conservatism. She spoke about holding children in her arms, about seeing their fear and confusion, about working behind the scenes to reunite families and improve conditions. The cameras loved her. The room was respectful, and even Democratic committee members seemed impressed by her apparent sincerity. Then it was Jasmine's turn. She had been invited to provide the Democratic perspective on border policies and family separation, specifically focusing on the legal challenges facing unaccompanied minors and the constitutional issues surrounding prolonged detention. Her testimony was factual, data-driven, and devastating in its clinical precision. She cited court cases, referenced international human rights standards, and methodically dismantled the legal justifications for many of the policies that Melania had just defended. But she was careful, respectful even. She addressed Melania as Mrs. Trump and acknowledged her stated commitment to children's welfare. She didn't attack personally, didn't question motives, and didn't turn the hearing into a partisan battlefield. Instead, she let the facts speak for themselves, building a case that was stronger for its restraint and more convincing for its professional delivery. That restraint, however, was about to be tested in ways that would shock the political world. As the formal testimony concluded, Chairman Webb opened the floor for questions and dialogue between the witnesses. This was supposed to be an opportunity for respectful exchange, a chance for both women to engage on policy details and find common ground. Instead, it became the moment when political civility died and raw power dynamics took over. Melania, who had maintained her composed demeanor throughout Jasmine's presentation, suddenly shifted in her chair. Her expression hardened almost imperceptibly, her smile becoming tighter and more controlled. When she spoke, her voice carried an edge that hadn't been there during her prepared remarks. "Congresswoman Crockett," she began, her slight Slovenian accent more pronounced when she was stressed, "I appreciate your passion for these issues, but I think you fundamentally misunderstand the complexities of border security and the realities that families face when they choose to enter our country illegally." The word "choose" hung in the air like a weapon. It suggested that families fleeing violence, persecution, and poverty had somehow selected their traumatic circumstances, that children separated from their parents had somehow opted for detention and uncertainty. Jasmine's eyebrow raised slightly, but her voice remained level. "Mrs. Trump, with respect, many of these families are asylum seekers who have followed legal procedures and still found themselves separated from their children. The choice was often between potential death in their home countries and seeking protection in America." "But that's exactly my point," Melania responded, her voice growing sharper. "You've spent your entire career making excuses for people who break our laws. You've built your reputation on defending criminals and illegal immigrants, and now you want to lecture me about compassion and family values?" The room shifted uncomfortably. This was moving beyond policy disagreement into personal attack territory, and everyone could feel the temperature rising. Committee members exchanged glances, staff members stopped their note-taking, and the cameras seemed to zoom in instinctively, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Jasmine remained remarkably calm, but those who knew her recognized the subtle signs of her building intensity. Her posture straightened slightly, her hands became perfectly still, and her gaze became more focused. She had faced hostile judges, aggressive prosecutors, and intimidating opponents throughout her legal career, and she had learned never to let emotion override strategy. "Mrs. Trump," she said quietly, "I've spent my career defending the Constitution and ensuring that everyone, regardless of their immigration status, receives due process under law. That's not making excuses for criminals. That's upholding American values." But Melania was just getting started. Perhaps emboldened by the formal setting, perhaps believing that her status as former First Lady gave her immunity from serious challenge, she decided to escalate in a way that would prove to be catastrophically miscalculated. "American values?" Melania's voice rose slightly, and for the first time, her carefully maintained composure began to crack. "Congresswoman, you've been in office for less than 2 years. You've never held executive responsibility, never had to make the kinds of difficult decisions that actually protect American families. You sit in your committee rooms and your television studios, making speeches and scoring political points, but you have no idea what real leadership looks like." She paused, letting her words sink in, clearly believing she had landed a devastating blow. The room was dead silent, waiting to see how Jasmine would respond to such a direct attack on her qualifications and experience. "Furthermore," Melania continued, her voice now carrying the kind of imperial authority that she had wielded as First Lady, "your radical positions and inflammatory rhetoric make you fundamentally unfit to guide policy on issues this sensitive and complex. You're more interested in grandstanding than governing, more focused on attacking successful women than actually helping children." The word "unfit" landed like a thunderclap. It wasn't just a policy disagreement anymore. It was a personal attack on Jasmine's character, competence, and right to participate in the political process. The accusation of attacking successful women was particularly loaded, suggesting that Jasmine's challenges to Melania were motivated by jealousy or resentment rather than genuine policy concerns. For a moment, the chamber was absolutely silent, the kind of silence that comes before earthquakes, before explosions, before moments that change everything. Jasmine sat perfectly still, her expression unreadable, her hands folded in her lap. She didn't appear angry or defensive or hurt. Instead, she looked like someone who had just been handed exactly the opportunity she had been waiting for. Slowly, deliberately, she reached into her leather portfolio and withdrew her laptop. Her movements were careful and measured, like a surgeon preparing for a delicate operation. She opened the computer, and the soft blue glow of the screen illuminated her face as she navigated to a specific file folder. "Mrs. Trump," she said, her voice carrying a deadly calm that made the previous tension seem mild by comparison. "Before we continue this discussion about who is unfit for what, I think this committee and the American people need to hear something that speaks directly to your qualifications and character." Her finger hovered over the trackpad, poised above an audio file that was about to detonate like a bomb in the middle of American politics. The file was labeled with a date from 18 months earlier, during the height of family separation policies, and it contained roughly 3 minutes of conversation that had been recorded without Melania's knowledge by a former White House staffer who had become increasingly disturbed by what they witnessed. "What are you doing?" Melania asked, and for the first time, uncertainty crept into her voice. She could see that Jasmine wasn't scrambling to defend herself or mounting a traditional political counterattack. Instead, she was preparing to reveal something, and the confidence in her manner suggested that whatever it was would be devastating. "I'm about to play a recording," Jasmine said simply, "that I believe speaks directly to your fitness for moral leadership and your genuine concern for the children you claim to advocate for." The room was now completely silent. Committee members leaned forward, staff members stopped all movement, and the cameras focused with laser precision on both women. Melania's face had gone pale beneath her carefully applied makeup, and her hands, which had been gesturing confidently throughout her testimony, were now gripping the edge of the witness table. "You can't," Melania began, but Jasmine cut her off with a raised hand. "Mrs. Trump, you just questioned my fitness for office and accused me of grandstanding rather than governing. I think the American people deserve to judge for themselves who is truly committed to protecting children and who is more interested in political theater." And then she clicked play. The audio quality was crystal clear, obviously recorded on professional equipment rather than a hidden device. The voices were immediately recognizable. Melania Trump speaking with what appeared to be her chief of staff and a senior advisor, discussing the political fallout from family separation policies and the pressure to visit detention facilities. At first, the conversation seemed routine, even sympathetic. Melania could be heard discussing logistics for a border visit, asking about photo opportunities, and expressing concern about security arrangements. But then, about 90 seconds into the recording, the conversation took a turn that would haunt her forever. Her advisor was explaining the political necessity of appearing more engaged with the children's welfare, suggesting that she spend more time interacting with families and less time on formal presentations to officials. The advisor emphasized how important it was for her image to be seen as caring and maternal, especially given the criticism her husband's administration was facing. That's when Melania's voice became audibly frustrated, taking on a tone of imperial annoyance that was completely at odds with her public persona of gracious concern. "I'm tired of pretending to care about every sob story," her voice said clearly through the chamber's sound system. "These people chose to come here illegally. They chose to put their children at risk, and now I'm supposed to fix their problems. I have my own family to worry about." The room was absolutely frozen. Every person in the chamber was staring at the laptop speakers, unable to believe what they were hearing. But Melania's voice continued, and what came next was even worse. "Honestly," the recording continued, "who cares about the children? I mean, really, who cares? They're not American children. Their parents broke our laws. Why is this my responsibility?" The silence that followed was deafening. For nearly 10 seconds, no one moved, no one spoke, no one even seemed to breathe. The words, "Who cares about the children?" seemed to echo through the chamber like a condemnation, like a judgment, like the end of a carefully constructed political career. Jasmine let the recording continue for another 30 seconds, capturing Melania's complaints about having to visit dirty facilities and her frustration with having to pretend to be emotional around children who were probably going to be criminals anyway. By the time she finally stopped the playback, Melania Trump looked like she had been physically struck. Mrs. Trump, Jasmine said into the stunned silence, her voice carrying the kind of prosecutorial authority that had made her legendary in Texas courtrooms. You just called me unfit for office. You accused me of grandstanding rather than governing. You suggested that I attack successful women out of jealousy or political calculation. She stood up slowly, her presence somehow commanding the entire chamber despite her relatively small stature. But what we just heard wasn't grandstanding. It wasn't political calculation. It was your own voice, expressing your actual feelings about the children you claim to advocate for. Melania tried to respond, but no words came. Her carefully constructed composure had completely shattered, and she looked like someone who had just watched their entire public persona collapse in real time. Her mouth opened and closed silently, her hands trembled slightly, and for the first time in perhaps decades, she appeared completely vulnerable and exposed. The American people just heard you say, "Who cares about the children?" when discussing kids who had been separated from their families, Jasmine continued, her voice growing stronger and more forceful. They heard you complain about having to pretend to care about their suffering. They heard you refer to these children as future criminals. She picked up a folder from her table, thick with documents and photographs. Mrs. Trump, since you've questioned my fitness for office, let me share some information about my qualifications. I've spent the last 15 years representing families in immigration court. I've held children who were separated from their parents. I've seen the trauma in their eyes, the confusion, the fear. Opening the folder, she pulled out a series of photographs. These are pictures from the detention facility you visited for that photo opportunity you were discussing in the recording. But these aren't the posed shots that made it into your social media posts. These are the real conditions those children were living in. The photographs were devastating. Children sleeping on concrete floors wrapped in foil emergency blankets, overcrowded cells with no privacy, no comfort, no dignity. Kids sitting alone in corners, staring at nothing, their faces blank with trauma. The contrast with Melania's polished social media images couldn't have been starker. While you were complaining about having to pretend to be emotional, Jasmine said, holding up one particularly heartbreaking image of a toddler reaching through chain-link fencing, these children were living in conditions that would be considered criminal if they were inflicted on animals. She turned to face Melania directly, and when she spoke, her voice carried the full weight of moral authority. You want to know who cares about the children, Mrs. Trump? I do. The American people do. Everyone in this room who still has a functioning conscience does. The question isn't who cares about these children. The question is how someone who claims to be a mother, someone who claims to be a Christian, someone who claims to represent American values could listen to their suffering and ask, who cares? By this point, Melania had recovered enough to attempt a response, but her voice was shaky and defensive. That recording was taken out of context, she said weakly. You don't understand the pressures, the impossible situations we were dealing with. It's easy to judge when you've never had real responsibility. But Jasmine was ready for that deflection. Mrs. Trump, I've listened to the entire recording, all 47 minutes of it. There is no context that makes those statements acceptable. There is no pressure that justifies asking who cares about the children when discussing kids who have been traumatized by government policies. She opened her laptop again, and Melania visibly flinched. Should I play more? Should we hear the part where you discuss how to minimize your visit time to avoid catching diseases from those people? Should we hear your thoughts on why these families probably deserve what they're getting? No, Melania said quickly, and that single word was perhaps the most damning moment of all. It was an admission that there was more, that the recording contained even worse revelations, that her public persona was built on a foundation of lies and carefully hidden contempt. Jasmine closed the laptop and returned to her seat, but her presence still dominated the room. Mrs. Trump, you called me unfit for office, but I've never looked at a suffering child and asked, who cares? I've never complained about having to show compassion to vulnerable people. I've never had to pretend to care about justice because caring about justice is who I am. The committee chairman looked like he was in shock, clearly unprepared for the hearing to take such a dramatic turn. Other committee members were frantically passing notes to their staff, trying to figure out how to respond to a situation that had moved far beyond their prepared talking points. But Jasmine wasn't finished. She stood again, this time holding a thick legal brief. Since we're discussing fitness for office, let me tell you what I've accomplished in my less than 2 years in Congress. I've authored legislation that has reunited over 400 families that were separated by the policies you defended. I've secured funding for trauma counseling for children who survived detention. I've worked with both parties to create legal pathways for asylum seekers that protect both security and human rights. She opened the brief revealing page after page of legislative achievements, court victories, and policy changes. I've done this work not for photo opportunities or social media posts, but because I believe that how we treat the most vulnerable people among us defines who we are as a nation. Looking directly at Melania, she delivered what would become the most quoted line of her political career. "You ask who cares about the children, Mrs. Trump. I care. I've always cared. And I'll never stop caring, because that's what fitness for office actually means. It means putting the welfare of others before your own comfort, your own image, your own political calculations." The chamber erupted. Not in applause or cheers, but in the kind of stunned murmur that follows a revelation so shocking that people need to process it in real time. Committee members were speaking urgently to their staff, journalists were frantically typing on their phones, and camera operators were adjusting their equipment to capture every nuance of what had just transpired. Melania sat in her chair, looking smaller somehow, as if the recording had physically diminished her. Her expensive suit suddenly looked like a costume, her perfect hair seemed artificial, and her composed expression had been replaced by the look of someone who knew their carefully constructed world was collapsing around them. "Mrs. Trump," Jasmine said, her voice now carrying a tone of finality, "you came here today to defend your record and attack mine. But the American people have now heard your true feelings about the children you claim to serve. They've seen the real conditions those children faced while you posed for pictures, and they can judge for themselves who is truly unfit for leadership." She gathered her materials, but before sitting down, she delivered one final statement that would define her political legacy. "I don't need to attack successful women, Mrs. Trump. I just need to tell the truth. And the truth is that success without compassion, power without empathy, and leadership without love are not success at all. They're moral failures dressed up in expensive clothes." The aftermath was immediate and devastating. Within minutes of the hearing's conclusion, clips of the recording were circulating on every social media platform. News networks interrupted their regular programming to play the audio, and the phrase, "Who cares about the children?" became an instant shorthand for political hypocrisy and moral bankruptcy. Melania's staff rushed to control the damage, but there was no containing the firestorm. The recording was authentic, verified by multiple sources, and impossible to explain away. Her attempts to claim it was taken out of context, fell flat, when journalists requested the full recording and found that the context actually made her statements worse, not better. Within 48 hours, sponsors began pulling their support from Melania's charitable foundation. Fashion magazines that had featured her on their covers issued statements distancing themselves from her brand. Even Republican politicians who had previously praised her work with children began avoiding questions about her fitness for any future political role. But for Jasmine Crockett, the moment marked the beginning of a new chapter in American politics. Her calm, fact-based destruction of Melania's credibility became a masterclass in political communication that was studied in universities, discussed in strategy sessions, and celebrated by anyone who believed the truth could still triumph over carefully constructed lies. The hearing had lasted less than 3 hours, but it changed the trajectory of both women's careers forever. Melania Trump, who had once been considered a potential political figure in her own right, saw her public image permanently damaged by her own words. Jasmine Crockett, meanwhile, emerged as a national figure whose combination of prosecutorial skill, moral clarity, and unshakable composure made her one of the most formidable voices in American politics. In the days that followed, Jasmine received thousands of messages from families who had been affected by family separation policies, from immigration attorneys who had fought the same battles she had, and from Americans across the political spectrum who were inspired by her willingness to speak truth to power. She had done more than expose Melania Trump's hypocrisy. She had shown that careful preparation, moral conviction, and strategic patience could still triumph over privilege, position, and political calculation. The recording that only 3 people had known about became the catalyst for a broader conversation about leadership, compassion, and the true meaning of fitness for public service. And Jasmine Crockett, the woman who had been called unfit by a former First Lady, had proven that sometimes the most powerful response to an attack is simply to let the truth speak for itself. The Capitol chamber began to empty, but the real drama was just beginning. As Melania Trump's security detail quickly escorted her through a side exit, avoiding the growing crowd of reporters, Jasmine Crockett remained seated at the witness table, calmly organizing her papers as if she had just concluded a routine committee hearing rather than delivered one of the most devastating political exposés in recent memory. Committee Chairman Marcus Webb looked like a man who had just witnessed a car accident in slow motion. His carefully planned hearing on border policy had transformed into a political earthquake that would dominate news cycles for weeks. He gavelled the session closed with unusual haste, but the damage was already spreading far beyond the confines of the Capitol building. Outside the chamber, Jasmine's chief of staff, Marcus Williams, was fielding a constant stream of calls from news producers, political strategists, and advocacy organizations. His phone had started buzzing the moment the recording began playing, and it hadn't stopped. Every major network wanted Jasmine for exclusive interviews, political podcasters were requesting immediate appearances, and late-night comedy shows were already writing segments around the "Who Cares About the Children" soundbite. But Jasmine had learned long ago that the moments immediately following a major political victory were often the most dangerous. When you've just humiliated someone with the power and connections of Melania Trump, the counterattack is inevitable and usually swift. She needed to be strategic about her next moves, careful not to overplay her hand or appear to be gloating over what many would see as a personal destruction rather than a policy victory. As she walked through the Capitol corridors, Jasmine was intercepted by Senator Elizabeth Warren, who had been watching the hearing from the gallery. Warren's expression was a mixture of admiration and concern. "That was brilliant," Warren said quietly, falling into step beside Jasmine. "But you know they are going to come for you now, right? Melania may be damaged goods, but she still has allies, and they're going to want revenge." Jasmine nodded grimly. She had expected this conversation and had already begun preparing for the inevitable backlash. "I know, but Senator, I couldn't let her sit there and lecture me about fitness for office while I had evidence of her saying those things about children. The truth had to come out." "I'm not questioning your decision," Warren replied. "I'm just saying you need to be ready for what's coming. They'll attack your methods, question how you got the recording, try to make this about political dirty tricks rather than her actual words." Within hours, Warren's prediction proved accurate. Conservative media outlets and Trump allies began a coordinated campaign to shift focus away from the content of Melania's recorded statements and toward questions about how Jasmine had obtained the audio. Fox News led the charge with a primetime segment titled, "Did Jasmine Crockett Break the Law?" while Trump-aligned websites published articles questioning the ethics of using private recordings in congressional hearings. The response was predictable, but also revealing. Rather than defending Melania's statements or explaining the context that supposedly made them acceptable, her allies were focusing entirely on attacking Jasmine's tactics. It was a classic deflection strategy, but one that inadvertently confirmed that the recording's contents were indefensible. Jasmine had anticipated this line of attack and was ready with a comprehensive response. The whistleblower who had provided the recording was a former White House staffer who had become increasingly disturbed by what they witnessed during the family separation crisis. The recording had been made using official White House equipment during what was supposed to be a policy planning session, meaning it was technically a government document rather than a private conversation. More importantly, Jasmine's office had consulted with congressional ethics experts and constitutional lawyers before deciding to use the recording. The consensus was clear. When a public official makes statements that directly contradict their public positions and reveal information relevant to their fitness for office, those statements become matters of legitimate public interest, especially when revealed in an official congressional proceeding. The legal foundation for using the recording was solid, but Jasmine knew that wouldn't stop her opponents from trying to muddy the waters. She decided to address the controversy head-on during a press conference the day after the hearing, knowing that her response would set the tone for how the story developed. Standing at a podium in the Capitol's press gallery, flanked by enlarged photographs of the detention facilities Melania had visited, Jasmine faced a room packed with national and international reporters. The contrast was deliberate and powerful. While her critics focused on process questions, she kept the spotlight on the children who had suffered under the policies Melania had privately mocked. Yesterday, I played a recording that revealed the true feelings of someone who has positioned herself as an advocate for immigrant children, Jasmine began, her voice carrying the same calm authority that had dominated the hearing. Since then, there have been questions about the propriety of revealing this information. Let me be absolutely clear. When public officials make statements that contradict their public positions and reveal callous disregard for vulnerable children, the American people have a right to know. She gestured to the photographs behind her, images that showed the stark reality of detention conditions. These children deserved advocates who genuinely cared about their welfare, not someone who privately asked, "Who cares about the children?" while publicly posing for photo opportunities. The ethics question isn't whether I should have revealed that recording. The ethics question is how anyone could hear those words and remain silent. The press conference was masterful political theater. Every question about her tactics allowed Jasmine to pivot back to the substance of Melania's statements and the broader issues of accountability and compassion in government. When a reporter asked whether she had violated Melania's privacy, Jasmine responded by reading testimonials from families who had been separated under the policies Melania had defended. When another journalist questioned whether the recording might have been selectively edited, Jasmine offered to release the entire 47-minute file, knowing that the full context actually made Melania's statements worse, not better. The offer put her critics in an impossible position. They couldn't continue claiming selective editing without risking the release of even more damaging material. But the most powerful moment came when a conservative reporter attempted to frame the controversy as a partisan attack on a former First Lady. Jasmine's response would be quoted in political science textbooks for years to come. "This isn't about partisan politics," she said, her voice rising slightly for the first time during the press conference. "This is about the difference between public service and public performance. Mrs. Trump performed compassion for the cameras while privately expressing contempt for the children she claimed to serve. That's not a Republican issue or a Democratic issue. That's a human decency issue." The press conference effectively ended the debate about Jasmine's tactics and refocused national attention on the substance of Melania's recorded statements. Editorial boards across the country praised Jasmine's handling of both the hearing and the subsequent controversy, with many noting that her combination of prosecutorial skill and moral clarity represented a new model for political leadership. The New York Times editorial board wrote, "Representative Crockett has demonstrated that careful preparation and unwavering principle can still triumph over political calculation and artificial imagery. Her willingness to speak truth to power, backed by irrefutable evidence, represents the kind of leadership our democracy desperately needs." Even some conservative commentators grudgingly acknowledged the effectiveness of Jasmine's approach. Wall Street Journal columnist Peggy Noonan wrote, "One may disagree with Representative Crockett's politics, but one cannot question her preparation, her composure, or her commitment to the principles she advocates. In an era of political theater and manufactured outrage, she demonstrated the power of substance over style. The impact extended far beyond media coverage. Within a week of the hearing, Jasmine's congressional office was flooded with resumes from lawyers, policy experts, and advocates who wanted to work for someone who had proven willing to challenge powerful interests on behalf of vulnerable populations. Her campaign fundraising, which had been modest for a second-term representative, suddenly exploded with small-dollar donations from across the country. More significantly, the hearing had changed the political calculus around immigration policy. Republican lawmakers who had previously been confident in defending family separation policies suddenly found themselves having to answer questions about Melania's recorded statements. The audio had personalized the cruelty of these policies in a way that statistics and legal arguments never could. Senator Ted Cruz, who had been one of the most vocal defenders of strict border enforcement, was confronted by reporters asking whether he agreed with Melania's assessment that people should ask, "Who cares about the children?" His stammering, evasive response went viral on social media and became a symbol of how Jasmine's revelation had shifted the entire debate. The hearing also had international repercussions. European leaders who had maintained diplomatic relationships with the Trump family began distancing themselves from Melania specifically. The recording was played in parliaments across Europe, with foreign ministers expressing shock at the callousness revealed in her private statements. Human rights organizations cited the audio as evidence of the systematic dehumanization that had enabled family separation policies. But perhaps the most meaningful impact was on the families who had been directly affected by these policies. Jasmine's office began receiving letters and calls from parents who had been separated from their children, thanking her for giving voice to their suffering and holding accountable those who had implemented and defended the policies that had traumatized their families. One letter from a mother in El Salvador whose 6-year-old daughter had been detained for 8 months was particularly moving. "Thank you for caring when they didn't. Thank you for asking the right questions when they wouldn't. Thank you for showing my daughter that someone in America fought for her when the people in power asked, 'Who cares about the children?'" These letters reminded Jasmine why she had entered politics in the first place and why moments like the hearing were so crucial. Behind every policy debate, every congressional hearing, and every political controversy were real people whose lives were affected by the decisions made in Washington. Her willingness to confront Melania Trump wasn't about partisan point scoring or personal ambition. It was about ensuring that those real people had advocates who would fight for them, even when it was politically risky. As the weeks passed and the initial shock of the hearing began to fade, it became clear that Jasmine had achieved something rare in modern politics. She had changed the conversation in a fundamental way. The phrase, "Who cares about the children?" became a rallying cry for advocates of humane immigration policy and a cautionary tale about the dangers of disconnected political leadership. The hearing also established Jasmine as a national political figure in her own right. Speculation about her future began almost immediately, with political observers noting that her combination of legal expertise, moral clarity, and media savvy made her a natural candidate for higher office. Senate seats, gubernatorial races, and even presidential campaigns were mentioned as potential next steps for someone who had proven capable of standing up to the most powerful interests in American politics. But for Jasmine, the focus remained on the work itself rather than the political opportunities it might create. She used her elevated profile to push for comprehensive immigration reform, increased funding for family reunification efforts, and stronger oversight of detention facilities. The hearing had given her a platform, and she was determined to use it effectively. The legacy of that day in the Capitol chamber would endure long after the news cycles moved on to other stories. It had demonstrated that truth, properly presented and strategically deployed, could still cut through the noise of modern political discourse. It had shown that preparation and principle could triumph over privilege and performance. And it had proven that sometimes the most powerful response to an attack is simply to let the evidence speak for itself. Most importantly, it had reminded America that the question, "Who cares about the children?" should never be asked cynically or dismissively. Because in a decent society, the answer should always be, we all do. If you found this story as compelling as we did, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss our deep dives into the moments that define American politics. What do you think made Jasmine Crockett's response so devastatingly effective? Was it her preparation, her restraint, or simply the power of truth? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to share this video with anyone who believes that authenticity can still triumph over artifice in our political system. We'll see you in the next video where we explore what this moment means for the future of political accountability in America.